Right. So, hi, everyone. I've gotten the signal to go. Greetings. My name is Greetings from San Francisco. I'm Philip Young, President and CEO of World Affairs. And I'm really pleased to welcome you all to one more of our pop-up programs. As we've done in the past, we're pulling together right now an informal impromptu discussion with a noted expert who we had here today to address a particularly pressing issue. So to make sure, though, all of you are where you want to be today, I'm really pleased to host for you a conversation with well-known national security expert Joe Cirincione. And we're talking about Russia, nuclear weapons, and the implication of recent events on geopolitics and security in the future. Many of you know Joe. He's currently a distinguished fellow at the Quincy Institute in Washington, D.C. He's a well-known national security analyst and author with over 35 years of experience, author and editor of a number of books, 7 of them, if I remember, including Nuclear Nightmares, right, Joe? 7?
Yes, 7 books.
Securing Nuclear Nightmares, Securing the World Before It's Too Late. I can't think of a better title for what we're talking about right now. And, you know, Joe also has made and continues to make countless TV appearances on pretty much every major, he's been on pretty much every major TV network. And he just wrote an op-ed last week that appeared in the Washington Post, which we will also talk about. And on a personal note, I've known Joe for many, many years. Since his retirement, I keep on telling him how much I miss him in terms of having somebody to bounce off ideas and talk to. I can't think of anybody who is smarter, more creative, and a clear explainer, really, of very complex concepts than Joe. And so we're in for a real treat. And so, Joe, thank you for being with us.
My pleasure, Philip, and I treasure our years together at the head of the Plowshares Fund. It was always great. We complimented each other very well, and I miss you too, buddy.
Thanks. So before we get started, logistics, we're going to talk about 30 minutes. We'll see how it goes. And then we're going to, because of the pop-up, and I think many of you have questions, please put your questions in the Q&A function and we'll get to them, okay? So why don't we get to it, Joe? Because we know each other so well, I'm going to ask you to indulge me a little bit. I'm going to do something very different I haven't done before, okay? And I know it may be difficult for you because I'm going to ask you to give me really, really short answers because I want you to...
But I talk a lot.
I know, but I want you to give short answers because I want you to set the stage and create interest as people are coming in, and we want them to stick around to hear what your answers are. So I want them to be sort of controversial or maybe like, what is this all about? I mean, they're complicated questions, but I want you to give me, if you can, answers in 5 words or less, okay? And so, I know. And so, let's get to the big bottom line questions that a lot of people have, and let's see where we go. 5 of them, okay? First one, what are the chances that Putin will actually use a nuclear weapon? And give me a percentage.
Greater than 0, but less than 50%, and that's bad enough.
Yes. Okay, great. That's good. I like it. Very short and concise. Under what circumstances do you think he would use a nuclear weapon?
If he sees his loss in Ukraine as an existential crisis that would affect him personally.
Okay, great. If he does use a nuclear weapon, what kind of nuclear weapon do you think it will probably be?
I would guess a 50-kiloton nuclear warhead, 4 or 5 times the size of Hiroshima, on a cruise missile like the Iskander. Okay.
All right. Everyone, please write these down because I know you're going to have questions about them. All right. Now, again, this is you hate to ask about this, but if something like that were used, what would be the human impact of one such device?
The greatest impact would be if it was directed at a city like Kherson, and you would be looking at the destruction of most of the city by blast or fire, and casualties, tens of thousands of dead, and perhaps 100,000 severely wounded. This is in a population of about 300,000 in peacetime. That's the population of Kherson.
Okay. And then the final question, have Putin's actions, whether, whether any of this comes to fruition or not, has Putin's actions changed the geopolitical landscape? Yes or no?
Absolutely. He's changed it already. This is the largest land grab we've seen in Europe since the end of World War II. If we were to use a nuclear weapon, it would be an unbelievably dramatic change in the geopolitics of the globe.
Okay.
Everybody would be affected by this.
Okay, so as a heads up, what we're going to talk about then, provided we have time, is, the obvious ones: Taiwan, Iran, North Korea, and we'll delve into that for all of you. And if any of you in the audience have questions, go ahead and put those into the Q&A function, and we'll get to them as best we can. Okay, so we got those answers. Let's put the answers that you just gave us into some meaningful context. So we spoke in February. Russian forces at that time were kind of bogged down. They're slowly advancing in huge numbers, right? And the consensus: Russia has superior firepower and men. Some were holding out hope that the Ukrainians' will to fight was going to, because it was so big, so much greater than the Russians, that they'd be able to forestall things. But the consensus was that Russia was going to prevail, right? And the best that could be hoped for was some kind of stalemate until some kind of political agreement could be come to in some fashion. So let's fast forward several months. Things have changed an incredible amount and are changing. Ukraine seems to be winning, but it's unclear what the end game is, and we'll ask you about that. And but what has really changed in a way is the prominence of nuclear weapons in this whole conversation, right? So a lot of seemingly contradictory stories that are coming out now about Putin and his threats. I mean, David Sanger wrote a article in the New York Times that says, what was it? Putin is finding out he doesn't really have as much flexibility using these, right? And to the public, that seems to me implies that we really don't have to worry about this. But he wrote an op-ed that was a little bit different. So what's going on here?
My op-ed is more in line with the views of U.S. military and intelligence officials, that this is no bluff. This is real. Yes, he's gaining benefit from the threat. And from the beginning of the war, he's been trying to deter us from intervening on the side of Ukraine. It hasn't worked, but that's been the effort. And now he wants to threaten us with continuing that intervention and trying to pressure us to stop the Ukrainian advance. The position that Putin is now in is really untenable. And this is something that I don't think anybody foresaw. On paper, there was no contest. On paper, at the beginning of the war, the Russian forces were far superior. Now you see a lot of analysis about how we neglected the intangibles: leadership, morale, underestimating the corruption in Russia had penetrated into the military itself. The equipment that they're using is defective, not in sufficient quantities. The incredible rigidity of the Russian command structure, that's all top down, compared to the Ukrainian structure, which is more, company level and up. So lots of initiatives being taken. And of course, the benefit of people from defending their country from a dictator's invasion, as opposed to the Russian side, where most of the troops have no idea why they're there in the first place. They weren't even told they were going to go to war. The case was never made about why you had to go to war, etc. So we're now in the position where Putin is losing. In fact, the Russian army looks very fragile at this point. I would not rule out a collapse of the army along the lines of the collapse of the Russian army in 1917, when they just deserted. They just stopped fighting. So that's possible here. Putin is trying to stem that by substituting quantity for quality, by rushing 200,000, 300,000 poorly trained men to the front. I think the Ukrainian edge in quality is going to beat that. But this is the battle that we're now seeing. If you play this out, now you understand why Putin is making nuclear threats. It's not just to deter us from intervening on the side of the Ukrainians. It's not just to sort of hold the line. He's trying to prevent his defeat and the consequences of that for his rule at home. That's the stakes for him right now.
So what's your response to, David Sanger and some of these other articles that I've been reading along these lines that, Vladimir Putin's a lot of, as you said, a lot of bluster. They talk about Vladimir Putin is now discovering that what the U.S. concluded years ago, and this is U.S. officials saying this, small tactical nuclear weapons are hard to use, hard to control, and far better a weapon of terror and intimidation than a weapon of war. So, the gist of this is, again, you don't have to worry about it, but,
Right. So that's right. I've known David and Bill Broad for quite a while, but there's a lot of mistakes in that piece. It was very uncharacteristic of them. For example, they seem to talk about Russian nuclear artillery. Russia doesn't have nuclear artillery. They gave that up back in the 90s, same as us. Used to have that. They misjudge the size. They make a statement like that a small nuclear war explosion would be less than a conventional explosion. No, it wouldn't. The smallest nuclear weapon in existence is still many times more powerful than the largest conventional bomb. So there's some mistakes there. But basically, I think they were making the mistakes of trying to have a rational analysis here with a leader who's not really rational, or to be fairer, may have other motives than military success. So they're absolutely right that nuclear weapons have very little military utility. These are weapons of terror. And the idea is to terrorize your adversary from attacking you or from taking actions contrary to your interest. And there's a reason they haven't been used in 77 years. We're the only ones who have ever used these in combat, because when you come right up to it, the consequences of using it outweigh the benefits. And it makes it very difficult. For example, if you're trying to conquer a country and you use nuclear weapons to conquer that country, you now have a radiated countryside, right? So you have a very common logistical problem, just things like that. And of course, in this case, there are consequences for use. It's not a last move. But Putin is trying to game this. As he's looking at this, he's trying to use a nuclear weapon, as it is detailed in Russian military doctrine, to escalate the conflict to such a point that the other side will give in. In fact, they call this doctrine, or it's called by some, escalate to de-escalate. You use a nuclear weapon not to start a nuclear war, but to cause the other side to sue for terms of that are acceptable to you. That's what he's trying to do here, and that's why he's threatening it, and that's why I think you can't rule this out. He's got the means to do it, he has the methodology for guiding it in the Russian doctrine, and he has the motive for doing it. He is losing, and as happy as we should be to see that, it also increases the risk that he's going to be desperate enough to do something that most analysts would say is a losing move. He may have no other choice.
So let's go then to, and we're going to talk about this, the nuclear doctrines that you talked about. You pointed out actually another one as well that I'll allude to. So let's talk about, and a lot of the chat has been coming through about questions about circumstances of use. I mean, I always presumed that, Putin would use nuclear weapons as a last resort. And the idea is that he would have no other alternative. One for David Carl. Hey, David. Said even if Putin felt that the developments in Ukraine would have an existential impact, he's asking, why would Putin escalate to the nuclear level without first attempting some other options, such as a massive, cyber attack or something that, potentially has that kind of, terrorist value or, no hostage taking value in a certain way.
Well, excellent point. And this is, the nuclear weapon is really a weapon of last resort. Because of all the downsides of using it, you really want to try everything else you got. And so he's doing that. Now, we haven't seen the cyber operations yet, and we'll get to the U.S. side of cyber operations in a minute. And we haven't seen those used, but yes, he could be using those. What we are seeing, in addition to his using the nuclear threat as a deterrent to try to stay the U.S. hand, and it's, to some extent, that's just real. There's no President Biden has said repeatedly, we're not going to fight World War III in Ukraine. The U.S. is aware of this and are trying to measure their support for Ukraine to help the Ukrainians as much as we can without escalating the conflict, without provoking Putin into possibly, pressing the button, as we say. But but he's also using other weapons that we don't talk about as much. We're seeing one today, as we talk, the weaponization of energy supplies.
Oh, right.
He has worked in cooperation with the Gulf monarchies to increase the cost of energy around the world by getting OPEC to cut production. This is his plan. He went into this war thinking that he had the greater staying power. And on paper, that looks right, that he could stay in battle longer than the Ukrainians can, and he could crack the Western support by nuclear threats, by raising the cost of energy, by getting the Western European and Central European governments to back away, by building up divisions in the United States over whether we should be supporting the Ukrainians or not. He is trying all these things. So we're going to see more of this, including nuclear terrorism of a new kind, threatening the catastrophic failure of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, for example. We saw that as a weapon. So he's pulling all the levers he can. It's just that his problems are mounting faster than his options. We're seeing fissures grow not in the West, but in Russia itself. We're seeing the Russian population for the first time take unbelievably dramatic action. I mean, you really have to be motivated to leave your family and flee the country. And it looks like at least 400,000 Russian men have now done that, more than what he's rushing to the front. Russian men have left the country rather than serve. So all these are in play. And the question for him is, can he crack the West before Russia cracks?
Well, so very clearly the Russian conscription and people fleeing, kind of raises the stakes. But I think for people here, you did talk about existential threat. It would be, I think it might be helpful for people in our audience for them to know maybe 2 or 3 existential threats that you see that could push Putin to the edge in the way that we're talking about.
Right, and I think there's legitimate existential threats, and what Putin would see as existential threats, and the legitimate ones are attacks on Russian territory, and this is why the aid to Ukraine has been limited. For example, we gave them the HIMARS, which are very precise artillery rockets that can travel 50 miles or more, giving the Ukrainians the ability to hit Russian targets deep behind their lines, and they're mobile, so they can shoot and scoot, so they can move away, so Russians can't attack them. And this has been very effective. What the Ukrainians want is a version of this that can fit on those same launchers called ATACMS, which is a 300-mile range rocket. The administration has been resisting giving them that because the Ukrainians might use that to attack some of the Russian forces on the Russian border that are launching their long-range rockets. They have rockets that can travel 300 miles, and to attack the Ukrainians, and they don't want to risk that. And I would say an attack on Russian territory would be that is certainly then puts it in the bailiwick of nuclear use. That is one of the things that the U.S. and Russia agree on, that an attack on the territory of the country, even a conventional attack, could result in a nuclear response. The other big existential risk is really not to Russia, although that's the way he frames it. The existence of Russia, it's to his existence, his ability to rule Russia. And, to what extent does Putin think, l'état est moi, I am the state. Yeah. And if I go, Russia goes. And this is where you start to run into serious problems. Because when we war game these scenarios, and believe me, they get war gamed all the time. There are multiple documents in DOD and State Department and the White House about what possible nuclear crises might happen, and another equally thick document on what the possible U.S. responses would be. So we're thinking about this all the time. But all of that is mainly based on the idea, as is the theory of deterrence, that there's a rational actor on the other side. So is Putin a rational actor? Is he making a cost-benefit analysis? Or does he believe the things that he's saying? You cannot watch that speech he made in the Kremlin over the weekend, the annexation speech, and think that this man is rational. I mean, this was This was way out there on the rationality scale. I mean, he framed this as a struggle between Russia and the world, and this Western cabal of Satan worshippers, of gender changers. Does he believe this? And increasingly, we're coming to believe that I think he does. And as he says, there is no world history without Russia. If he thinks that Russia, meaning him, is in risk of being defeated, he may bring down the house. He may have an apocalyptic vision. And now we come face to face with one of the central problems of the nuclear age. We have put the power to destroy all of humanity in the hands of a few men. Putin has the ability to launch not one, but hundreds or thousands of nuclear weapons, and no one can stop him short of a full-scale mutiny of the general staff. That's the situation. That's why I say in the beginning, this is a low probability. I don't think he's going to do this. I think it's extremely unlikely, but it's possible, and the consequences are enormous.
So you and I talked, I mean, one is you talked about intention, right? That's one thing to basically say, this is something that is in the cards, you're going to do this. There's this other thing that you're alluding to that I think applies to nuclear weapons and war in general, but nuclear weapons, the stakes are so much higher, is miscalculation, right? It is the notion that, we've seen, Medved for president, prime minister, and then, everyone talking about nuclear threats belittling and diminishing the likelihood of any major responses. They've done that in the past. What is the notion of safeguards here, right? I mean, one thing is you can say, is Putin, is he pulling a Nixon, right? Where he's acting crazy so people will think about this, right? This is all, so are there any safeguards right now in Russia?
You got to ask yourself, is Putin Nixon, who kind of intentionally did the madman theory, or is he Trump?
Right.
Is he Trump, who also has unfettered sole authority to launch nuclear weapons whenever he wants? So this is not a problem unique to Russia, but it's where the threat comes from right now. Biden isn't threatening nuclear holocaust. He's not making the nuclear threats. It's coming from Putin. That's the source of the problem. What are the checks and balances? Well, unfortunately, very few. And this is a change. We have to update our understanding of Russia and the nature of this regime. Because previously, there had been checks and balances. So whereas in the United States, it's sole authority, the president makes the decision, he can directly transmit that to the military forces, and there would be a launch. In Russia, there's not one nuclear football that follows the president around 24 hours, 7 days a week. There's three. The football being the briefcase that has the command, the controls, and the codes for ordering a nuclear launch. And it used to be with the head of state, the minister of defense, and the general who's the head of the chief of staff. And we think those footballs still exist. It used to be that you had to get the three of them to agree. And this was true under Gorbachev, for example, under the Soviet Union, and it was true under Yeltsin. And it used to be true under Putin. It's not clear it's still true because Putin has changed the regime. Even in the Soviet days, with the possible exception of Stalin, this was a collective leadership. You had a collective, those are your checks and balances here. Those checks and balances are gone. Putin has really consolidated one-man rule, a cult of personality, complete control over the press, over the society. He assassinates his political opponents. I consider this man a fascist. I can't see anything in his rule that is not fascist. Not the whole country, but him, his regime. This is a fascist regime. We've never had a fascist with nuclear weapons before. So we're already in uncharted territory. And to the best of my knowledge, there are no checks on him. If he wants to launch a war, no one's going to stop him. We just saw that. If he wants to launch a nuclear war, similarly, not only are there not going to be people who will stop him, there is already a lot of support for doing that. He's already getting his far right. He's not the worst.
Right.
in person in Russia. There are worse people than Putin even, but he's getting pressure already to start using nuclear weapons, and many nuclear weapons, if you believe the comments of some of the ultranationalists. So there would be plenty of people in the military and in the leadership circle who would support his use of nuclear weapons. So no checks. If he decides to press the button's going to get pressed.
So let's talk then. You alluded to what Biden's policy in the West. You were talking about what they were doing and what they were trying to do. I mean, obviously, as we've talked about, and in my experiences with North Korea and nuclear negotiations and the brinksmanship there, you got to give people a way out. There's got to be an off ramp, right? Always has to be. And so in your mind, do you think, the West and Biden, the administrator, they're finding the right balance? Do you feel like we should be a little more aggressive? What's the politics on this?
I think you could do more on diplomacy, but you have to understand, Putin does not want to negotiate.
Yeah.
Or more precisely, the kinds of negotiations he seeks right now are ones that would recognize his annexation. Those are his terms. Okay, so if you're Ukraine, are you going to let millions of Ukrainians live under Russian rule? This isn't just about territory, remember. This is about people. And you see what Bucha looked like. You see what Liman looked like. You see what it's like to live under Russian rule. And how are you going to tell Ukrainians, no, you shouldn't free your people? Maybe that would be a more attractive option if Ukraine was losing and they had no choice, but they're not losing. They have the real possibility of liberating much more of their population. So should there be an off-ramp? I think there should be, but it's probably not going to be a territorial off-ramp. It might have to be something like allowing Putin to live and to keep his money and to retire as a billionaire into Sochi. It might not face criminal indictment for the multiple war crimes he's committed. As distasteful as that is, that might be the price of getting an end to the war. And so when people say, well, let's do more on diplomacy for what end? For what end? Do you think that the U.S. is blocking diplomacy? Do you think that Ukraine is the problem? Look, if Russia stops fighting, the war is over. If Ukraine stops fighting, there's no more Ukraine. So it's not an equal situation here. You have to understand who started this war, who's escalating this war, and how and who can stop this war, and that's all on Putin. So yes, open up channels, talk to the Russian military behind the scenes, talk to Russian officials. What you see now is the U.S. spending a lot more time talking to China and India, trying to get Russia's allies to weigh in on this, both to end the war and to reduce the risk of nuclear use. And I think that's the proper course of action.
Okay. All right. Let's talk a little bit more. I want to touch a little bit on your great op-ed in the Post, where you laid out three kinds of uses. So I think it might be really interesting to just give really quickly what those three uses are. And you were thinking, as if I recall, it was mostly on a small weapons use.
Yeah,
a tactical
right.
weapon, right?
So, we tend to think about nuclear weapons as if it's still the Cold War, that it's going to be a spasm of missiles flying across the oceans. And this is October, and we're coming up to the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when that's exactly what the stakes look like. I would say we are now in a crisis where we're closer to the intentional use of nuclear weapons than we've been any time since then. It hasn't happened for 60 years like this, but it's not happening over 10 days in October. It's happening over 7-8 months. It's a slow roll here. And we're not talking about hundreds of weapons flying. We're talking about one or two starting it. And in this case, we're talking about battlefield weapons. So the difference is that a strategic weapon is basically one that goes long range. It depends, but it's on the ICBMs, on the submarine launched ballistic missiles. They span the ocean. They're usually quite large, 100 kilotons. Hiroshima was 15 kilotons, so 100, 400. We even have a 1 million ton, a megaton We have a megaton weapon, and the Russians come close to that on some of their rockets. But for the battlefield, you're basically looking at a range. It could be 100 kilotons as well, and we have those, and Russia has those. So the same size, but you're using them in the battlefield. You're using them for short range. They're on short-range rockets, cruise missiles, airdropped. But there's also, that's where you get into very small nuclear weapons. And by small, current standards, we mean Hiroshima size. 15 kilotons, 10 kilotons. We believe the Russians have one that go down to 1 kiloton. Now, let's be clear about this. 1 kiloton is still 1,000 tons of TNT. 1,000 tons of TNT. So our conventional bombs that we drop from, say, B-52s or fighter bombers are 1,000 pounds. That's a 1,000 pound bomb. And we're talking about one weapon being 1,000 tons. Okay? So even the smallest nuclear weapon is orders of magnitude more powerful than your conventional weapons. And you would use a small nuclear weapon to achieve sort of a battlefield success. And in this case, to be a signal that you're willing to cross that line and you're willing to go further. So possibilities. One, a demonstration shot. And Russian literature talks about this. In fact, in the early days of the nuclear age, in 1945, there were some Manhattan Project scientists who wrote a memo. I write about this in my other book, Bomb Scare, wrote a memo to Truman urging him to do a demonstration shot to show the world what we had rather than bomb a city. I think Putin could do that, fire a demonstration shot over the Black Sea or a sparsely inhabited area. But I think he would reject that for the same reason that the U.S. military rejected it in 1945. As shocking as it is, it's not shocking enough. And remember, the purpose would be not military advantage, but to shock the other side into surrender. So he could then use a 10 kiloton yield. On the Iskander missile, which has been used with conventional warheads in the battle so far, in the war so far, also has a nuclear mode. And he could take one of the nuclear warheads that is stored in central storage facilities in Russia, and we'd probably see him doing this. There was a recent scare just yesterday where people reported that a convoy seemed to be doing exactly that, but it was a misidentification. They'd move it from secure storage, made it to an Iskander missile, and it's got a dial a yield. A dial a yield, meaning it could, depending how you could configure the warhead, it could be 10 kilotons, or it could be 110 kilotons, and you would decide what yield you want. And you could do a very small one on a military target in Ukraine, and that would certainly get everybody's attention. Either the demonstration shot or the low yield would be the first time a nuclear weapon has been used in combat since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It'd be the first time anybody had seen an above-ground nuclear explosion since 1980. When the last country stopped doing atmospheric tests, China. We haven't seen this. So most of the world has never seen a mushroom cloud. Well, you would see it now, and in both instances, you would bring the world to a halt. This would be an incredibly shocking event. It'd be all we'd be talking about, and we would be at the precipice. We would be plunging into the chasm of nuclear terror. But I honestly think that still that wouldn't be shocking enough. So that's why I think he would go with the third option, which is a 50 kiloton or so weapon that's bigger than Hiroshima. That's 3 or 4 times Hiroshima. And he might even hit a city. Like suppose the Ukrainians liberate Kherson, which looks likely at this point. He could nuke Kherson, and that would be a massive, shocking, terrifying gesture. And the hope would be it would freeze the Ukrainians. It would say, do not advance anymore. I will nuke the next city you liberate. So that's the kind of brutal message he'd be trying to send. And he might think that that's got a reasonable chance of success. The final and fourth scenario is you drop that similar kind of weapon on a NATO country. Yeah. But now you for certain bring U.S. and NATO into the war because there'd be attack on NATO and we'd be coming screaming in. So those are the general categories of options. There are dozens of variations on this. I'm simplifying it so we can start to understand the practicality of a nuclear attack. What are we actually talking about here?
Okay, so I guess it's time to everybody take a collective deep breath for a second. I mean, that's pretty sobering. Maybe what I want to do and is, part of what we do here and why we're talking with you is to dig a little bit deeper from what you're going to probably hear on TV and even in the news, in the newspapers. So, without getting too steeped in wonkiness and deterrence theory and all this, one of the things that struck me, and I wanted to get your sense of this, is that the idea of deterrence and nuclear weapons, we know that this thing, there's a cottage industry. It's been studied for over a half a century, right? But the reality is, no one's really used a nuclear weapon in war since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And somehow, it always struck me there's this notion floating around in the general zeitgeist that policymakers really know what's going to happen or isn't going to happen, right? And that's another element of miscalculation, that you have this theoretical framework. You really don't know how it applies in the real world because it really hasn't been applied. You can't really tell by stopping something or it didn't happen that was actually the cause, right? So I just wanted, because there's so few historical precedents for this level of nuclear posturing and actually it going wrong, so then you could do a case study, right? Can you talk to me a little bit about, have we just been lucky? Are there, examples of de-escalation from this kind of scenario, other than the, Cuban Missile Crisis in different ways, or is this really uncharted territory?
It's not uncharted, but we're going further into the unknown than we have in 60 years. And one of the reasons, Graham Allison and others studied the Cuban Missile Crisis so closely is this was it. This is a real world example of how is deterrence working? How are leaders thinking about this? What is the conflicting advice you're getting from your advisors, from your bureaucracy? And there are contending schools in here about what you should do. So I would say just on this, there's two things to keep in mind. And this comes up a lot as you try to game these out or walk through these. And one is the fallacy of the last move. In other words, as you are looking at this, you believe that your move will be decisive, that this will turn the tide of battle. This will decide the conflict. But it doesn't work that way. The other side always has a move. And so that, leads you into this world of uncontrollability. And that's why so many of the war games that start off with precisely this scenario, a single use, you get a scenario where it quickly spirals out of control. You think you're making the last move, and in fact, the other side responds with a nuclear use of their own, and you feel the need to answer it in return. Let me say, hold on just a second. My machine just went off. I'm going to turn it off.
Okay. We have some technical issues right now.
Sorry.
It's okay.
That was it. Sorry. I could hear it a lot. I don't know. You could.
What that was.
And the other issue is sort of a theoretical issue that comes up, and they call it the need to restore deterrence. So right now you're seeing some articles about this. The position of the administration is not to make nuclear threats in response to Putin, right? And in many war games, as you played this out, that I'm familiar with, I know people who were in them, I know people who designed them. The U.S. position on this is not to answer in kind. That even if he uses a nuclear weapon, we have multiple responses that we can make that can not trigger a nuclear response and not compound the error by us using nuclear weapons as well. But there's a theoretical dispute about this, and you see some people, particularly in the strategic command or in that community, who are invested in nuclear weapons, who argue that if he uses nuclear weapons, it is essential that we use a nuclear response in order to restore deterrence, in order to deter anyone else from doing this in the future. And that's one of the things that makes the stakes so high. Even though the threat is coming from Putin, in the U.S. response, you're also going to have this kind of consideration And it's why, as you look at all the possible things we can do, which are numerous, none of them are really satisfactory. All of them have escalatory risks, which is why what you want to do is try to prevent Putin from doing this in the first place. That's your best option right now. And that's where I think we should be concentrating our efforts. And the administration seems to be doing that. I think they could do more.
So, there are questions throughout the chat that basically says, if they use nuclear weapons, what would the U.S. response be? What would you recommend? And you kind of allude to that.
Well, let me just, rather than me, my recommend, let me just say what I think they're going to be and what the administration has hinted at. So when Jake Sullivan said last weekend that there would be catastrophic consequences if Putin used this, a lot of people saw that as rattling our own nuclear saber. I don't think that's the intention at all. We are the most powerful nation in the world still, economically, politically, diplomatically, and militarily. We have lots of options. First thing, diplomatic isolation. Absolutely. You would just, universal condemnation of this. Even China and India would back away from Putin at this point. Resolutions at the UN Security Council, etc., things like that. A second, economic isolation. You think the sanctions are tough now? They're still connected to the banking system. People are still buying Russian oil and gas. That would all come to an end. All of that. Bang. Blockade. For any kind of nuclear use, but particularly one that killed large numbers of people. That would all come to an end. You would freeze them out. That's powerful, but the point is to stop him from doing this again. You would then have, and those by themselves are going to be very strong. You would also see military aid, depending on what scenario we're talking about, increasing to Ukraine. I would say a lot of the limits would be taken off. You'd have massive kind of increase. You have cyber options. We were talking about the Russian cyber options. We have multiple cyber options that people have not been thinking about. I believe we could turn Russia dark. We could bring down their electric grid, not kinetically, the way we did in Baghdad in 2003, where we dropped aluminum chaff on the transmission wires and shorted out all the electricity. That resulted in a very expensive repair job, very complicated repair job. We can do it with cyber now, and it has the benefit of being able to be reversed should Russia comply and stand down. And that's just the beginning of our cyber options. You can imagine what Putin's bank accounts in the Zurich banks might look like if he did this. Now you're really getting into an existential crisis, et cetera. And then finally, then you get to military. And there's conventional military options. We've spent decades developing incredibly precise intelligence, highly accurate and powerful conventional munitions. It's really true. If we see it, we can kill it. And we have conventional forces, ours and our NATO allies, that could destroy the Russian army in Ukraine in a matter of days. So rather than this being a win-and move, it would guarantee that he lost the war. And possibly, this is where you start to, options of crossing and attacking targets in Russia itself. And finally, there is a nuclear option. But I would say you're not going to see, the U.S. has no military gain from doing that, right? When we have all these other options. There's no reason to do that other than this ideological view that we have to restore deterrence. I would say the things I've just described would restore deterrence without going to nuclear use. We should never use a nuclear weapon under any circumstances.
Okay. All right. So let's go. I wanted to get to more questions. I've been sort of sprinkling them in as we've gone, and I want to get to some others specifically. But with the one last area, the geopolitical landscape. And, we could spend a whole hour on this, quite frankly, right? So let's just do one question here. And you can pick what you want. You've got Iran, you've got China, Taiwan, North Korea, some stuff related to this. What's the future hold, short term and longer term for you? What are the things that grab you short term, and then that you're thinking about longer term in terms of Putin's threats and what Russia is doing? Right.
One thing to start with is Ukraine. I mean, one of the problems we have in the United States is we're too U.S. centric. We think of ourselves. We think of our adversaries. We think of our power. this is about Ukraine. This is about real people who are being killed by the thousands, where the invading army is using rape as a matter of policy, where there's just 1.5 million Ukrainians have been forcibly deported to Russia. I mean, this is catastrophic for Ukraine. So if they win this war, I mean, that is going to be an enormous victory for the Ukrainian people, for the West that supported them, and for the forces of democracy. Because this is a democratic nation resisting a person I consider a fascist. And so this is Timothy Snyder is writing about this in Foreign Affairs this week. If you can get to that Foreign Affairs article, I recommend it, because he makes this case. This is going to be globally transformative for democracies. And demonstrating the strength of the democracies and pushing back against the belief that autocracies are rising in the world and the democracies are in decline. So that's number one. Number two, Russian power itself will be irrevocably changed. I mean, the Russian army will be shown to have been, a shadow of what we thought it was going to be. Russia's ability to project force in the future will be greatly diminished. You will have a united NATO, now enlarged to include people who have been neutral for centuries, are now allying with the West. And a great deal will depend on what you do with that. That doesn't mean you now have to boost defense spending. In fact, you've just eliminated the greatest threat you face if the Russian army is defeated and the Russian government changes. You could be looking at a very different European security system, one that relies much more on Europeans to defend their own country than the United States, because you've reduced the threat so much. You no longer need the balancing of the United States to secure European security. So that by itself will be a giant change. And of course, there's China, which brings into, what are the lessons that they're going to draw from this? And that brings you to Taiwan. And the lesson I think you would draw from this is that forcible annexation of a territory, even territory you consider to be rightfully yours, is not going to work in the modern world. And that changes the whole dynamic about what our relation will be with China and how we'll be dealing with them. And instead of this escalation of that we're seeing, tensions between the US and Russia, you could see a breakthrough in this and an accommodation on this. The way Iran was more eager to accommodate with the United States after we destroyed the Iraqi army in 3 weeks in 2003 than they were before. You saw that change. You saw that opening. We were too stupid to take advantage of that at the time. We blew it there. And we got to make sure that we're smarter now, that we're thinking about this now so we can take advantage of this. With great power comes great responsibility. With a great victory should come rethinking, should become, an emphasis on diplomacy and economic development rather than military hardware and military budgets.
So you talked about China and Taiwan. So, there's this sort of weird situation here where, you alluded to this before in some of your writing as well, the stability and instability paradox, right? Stability at the nuclear weapons level can create instability at a conventional arms level because there's greater incentive to use that because everybody's standing off. On one hand, you think about China, where they said, given what happened in Ukraine, there's no way they're going to do something like this, especially if Taiwan is successful in creating themselves as a porcupine strategy,
Yes.
Which, right?
Right. You see a lot of people talking about that, and it seems to be U.S. policy right now. That's exactly
right. So, what's your thinking on that?
Well, if Putin prevails, that would encourage China to continue the same kind of pressures. It doesn't make an invasion of Taiwan, imminent. It just means that they will see you can get away with this. Yeah. And you can cross those barriers. And if Ukraine wins, and remember, this is a war between Russia and Ukraine. This is not a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia. We didn't start this war. We didn't want this war. We made plenty of mistakes with NATO enlargement and ignoring Russian security concerns when we started putting missile interceptors in Poland and Romania. We made plenty of mistakes, but none of those mistakes justified this war. We're not out to get Russia. There was no actual security threat for Russia. They were not under attack. This is not a preventive war, as some of my colleagues insist on depicting it. So if Ukraine wins, if you're in China, man, you got to be taking a breath here, you got to be saying, well, this conquest of Taiwan, which they already knew was difficult, is it's going to be too difficult for us to do. So we better go, we should rethink our strategy and go back to the long and patient view, play the long game with Taiwan, and see if you can create conditions where Taiwan would voluntarily unify with China, which actually looked fairly likely 20, 30 years ago. It's almost impossible to imagine now, but if China, you would say, well, let's change that over the next 2 or 3 decades. Those are the kinds of considerations, and I'd love, this is the kind of thing you talk about on this podcast, on these events all the time, with people much more knowledgeable about Asia than I am.
So, okay, well, let's talk about something that you and I worked on significantly during our time at Plowshares Fund. And was talked about here at World Affairs is the Iran deal. Sort of where we're going. Yeah. How is all this getting impact? What's your view on that?
Well, I would say,
question people asked.
Right, absolutely. I mean, two things, and one's I'm going to fault the United States here. I mean, we should have wrapped this thing up, in January 2021. It was there for the taking. We had a reformist government eager to conclude the deal. We blew it. We took too long. We were seduced by our own power. We thought Trump's sanctions would give us leverage over China, over Iran, that we could negotiate a better deal. It was already a great deal. This deal worked. It stopped an Iranian nuclear bomb. It stopped a war with Iran. It worked. All we had to do was restore it. We should have done it. We didn't. Conditions changed inside Iran. We have a Raisi government now who is convinced. It has factions in it that don't want a deal. They would rather not have a deal with the great Satan. We have to understand this. And they hemmed and hawed, and they think they got leverage and they can wait us out. Well, now I would say the two things that are cutting against them is their sort of most immediate military ally, Russia, which has been supplying arms to them, and now ironically they're supplying arms to Russia, is in deep trouble and is going to be greatly weakened no matter what happens here, greatly weakened from this war. And two is what's happening inside the country, where there is an unprecedented rebellion taking place, led by Generation Z, 40% of the population is under 25, and those are the people out in the streets. They are losing the entire next generation of Iranians and being led by some incredibly brave women. And I bet you there were people in the Raisi governments, hitting their hand against their forehead saying we should have taken the deal. Because if they had taken this deal 2 or 3 months ago, they'd be in much better shape now, right? The economy would be revving up again, not the compounding the political repression with economic depression. So we don't know what's going to happen in Iran, but I would say I would bet the Raisi government's going to look more favorably on the terms that are on the table, and I would not rule out a revival of the JCPOA in the months ahead.
Okay. There's a question here that I thought was really interesting. Do we really think the inner circle of the Kremlin would stand by and watch Putin expose the motherland to obliteration or at least partial destruction because the man's feeling humiliated by the West?
They would not want to stand by. I completely understand that sentiment. It's a question of capability. It's like the people who tried to take out Hitler. They understood what the problem was. They understood what the answer was. They just couldn't do it. And this is what I mean about understanding what Putin has done over the last few years. And what he's, if you oppose him, you're gone. This is like the Trumpian loyalty oath on steroids. So it'd be extremely difficult. And Putin understands this. He's no strategic genius. I mean, he was a mid-level KGB officer. It's not like he's brilliant. He's just ruthless. Ruthless. You see what he's doing to Navalny. I mean, this, what he does to people who have been on TV reciting anti-war poems. The police come to your house at night and they beat you and rape you. That's what his rule is like. So you got to be real gutsy to be a senior official and to say, I'm going to stand up to Putin. And how do you even organize a rebellion like that? Well, part of what I think the U.S. is doing right now is to try to create some channels to the general staff, to the oligarchs, talking to them, seeing if you can encourage just such a rebellion. I just think things are going to have to get a lot worse before people are going to be willing to make that leap. And I hope the person who's asking the question, I hope you're right. I hope there are courageous people in Putin's inner circle who will do the right thing if it comes to this.
Okay, so Joe, we're coming up on our about time to wrap up. Thank you. Apologies to people for not being able to ask all of the questions that they gave to us. So, what I always do with one of these, when we talk is, if there are like 2 points that you wanted to make sure that people left with, what are the 2 big takeaways from you in this conversation that we've had?
Putin is losing. He is the source of this war. He's the source of the nuclear threats. But as he loses, he's going to get more desperate. So unfortunately, the risks increase. So we should be alert to this. Number one. And number two is the U.S. has made many, many mistakes in the past. And I'm not just talking about the last 20 years. I mean the last 2 centuries of the way we've used our power and who we've used it against. But in this instance, the United States leadership is first rate. They are doing the right thing, and they're trying to do it as carefully as possible. I think if most of us in this podcast were in their position right now, we'd be doing exactly what they're doing, trying to aid the Ukrainian people, trying to resist a fascist invader, and not bring this to the unimaginable nuclear nightmare stage that we've spent the last 45 minutes discussing.
Okay, so Joe, thank you so much for sharing your insights. Thank you for agreeing to do this sort of last second. Wanted to be respectful of your time, people in the audience. So thank you for taking time out of your day to join us and listen to the perspectives that we have here. Stay on the lookout for more pop-ups that we have as things are always happening. So yeah. We'll do what we can do on that side. Just wanted to alert you, for those of you who are in the Bay Area, we have a couple of in-person events that are going to be happening. So feel free to go to worldaffairs.org to find out about those. We're also having a number of other events as well that are going to be online that I think you'll find very, very interesting. So with that, I can say one final thing. We have our World Affairs podcast and radio program, so you can learn more about that and hear about things like Ukraine and what else is going on in the world. So, Joe, again, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. It's great, great fun.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on, Philip.
Yeah, and to all of you, thank you for joining us. If you have questions, let us know. You can, Joe, if people have questions for you directly, is there a place they can contact you?
Sure. You can email me directly. My shortest email is joecirin@me.com. That's JOECIRIN@me.com. Or you can follow me on Twitter @Cirincione.
Yep, do that. He's got a lot of followers, a lot of fun discussions that go on his Twitter account. All right, that's it. We are at 1 o'clock. Everyone, thank you so much. And we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.